Well, hello, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at our last bit of the Cold War, and that will take us all the way up through the end of the Cold War. As you recall, the Cold War, it was that struggle for power and influence between the United States and the Soviet Union over this period from the end of World War II, 1945, all the way through the dissolution of the Soviet Union here in 1991. And so, if your parents or grandparents were born between these two dates, then they were born and lived during the Cold War. And you can see that, at least this map will show you, that when it says the Cold War turns hot, there you can see the Cuban Missile Crisis and Korea and Vietnam and a number of other places that we experienced some hot spots in our conflict with the Soviet Union, as we're both trying to influence the third world to join our side. You know, that was kind of the main thing, the struggle for power and influence. To say, hey, our side's better. You know, we're the Ukes. No, our side's better. We're the Zooks. Eat the butter side up. No, eat the butter side down. So again, the butter side up is democratic capitalism, with elections as the way to determine your leadership, and really a focus on freedom as the main ideological thing that you're trying to stress. Whereas the Zooks over here, their butter side down idea is no, the main thing should be equality, and everybody should have their needs taken care of, and that the best government is the one where they have, you know, these Soviet leaders in charge, etc., etc. And that's the struggle for power over this long period of time called the Cold War. Had we ever started launching missiles at each other, right? If the Cuban Missile Crisis had turned hot and nukes hit here and here and here, and then our nukes were fired over here and here and here, then the whole world would likely have come to an end. A lot of scientists speculate that with enough nuclear weapons going off at the same time, so much soot and dirt and just debris gets launched up into outer space, and that it can really cover the entire planet. And, you know, if the entire planet is covered and you can't get enough light through, you can kill off all the trees and vegetation all over. It doesn't matter if a nuke never hit down here in Brazil. If there's no light coming in, if there's no way for photosynthesis to occur, and all the vegetation dies, all the insects die, all the animals die, the whole planet dies. So this is why we say that had this war been a hot war, then yeah, all life on the planet could conceivably have come to an end with this what's called a nuclear winter, right? Imagine no heat making its way because the entire world is surrounded by this debris that just gets shot up into the atmosphere after a nuclear bomb goes off. And you saw that mushroom cloud. So imagine mushroom clouds everywhere, all around there, sending all this debris, covering up the earth, and causing death of the entire world. Well, yeah, scary thought. Scared them too. Mutually assured destruction was something that they realized, we got to find some way out of this. And for a period of time in the 1970s, there is going to be this movement towards lowering the tensions. Soviet Union, the United States, after all what's been going on, and Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam, etc. By the 1970s, there's somewhat of an interest to try to find a way to lower the tensions. And that's kind of what this fancy French word is called, détente. It's just a way of trying. We gotta chill. We gotta bring this down. We've gotten too close in the past, and we've got to avoid that. So what can we do? How can we make each other feel better? Here's Nixon, okay, and here's Brezhnev. We haven't really talked about him. He's the new Soviet leader because no longer is there. Remember Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, he got ousted, and now they had a new Soviet leader. His name is Brezhnev. And in any event, you can see this Time magazine. They're saying, well, they're going to try this out. They're going to see if there's any way that the United States and the Soviet Union, still with all of our nuclear weapons, is there any way that we can maybe work out some sort of lessening and lowering of the tensions. And we do. We make some agreements with the Soviets. There's this thing called SALT I, that's the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, where we decide, we're going to reduce some of our weapons and, make each other feel better by having fewer weapons and agreements on, what kind of weapons and where we're going to place them. And that's a good thing, because that gives people some confidence that, we're not just out to kill you. We're going to try to, work on a way to lower and reduce tensions. So that's happening during the 1970s. During the 1970s as well, the United States is trying to kind of make inroads to try to become more friendly with China. Nixon famously goes to China and tries to make friends with the Chinese, which was probably a good thing because at that time the Chinese had broken away from the Soviet Union. So these two communist countries, the Chinese communist and the Soviet communists in Russia, they were starting to fight each other. And so the United States said, "Oh, this would be a good time for us to kind of, see if we can play them off each other and maybe see what we can do to, be friends, to try and be friends to both sides." And so it was a really weird time in the 1970s. We even met the Soviet Union up in outer space. We had our spaceships go up and link up with their satellites, and we had a Russian cosmonaut. They called their astronauts cosmonauts. We had a Russian cosmonaut, their spaceship connected with our spaceship, and so an American astronaut and a Russian cosmonaut, we boarded each other's spaceships up there in outer space. And that was a really big deal because people said, well, if America and Russia can work like that, up in outer space and be friends and trying to do something like the right thing down, maybe all of that fear and Red Scare, maybe that's all over. Well, it wasn't. Cold War thaw didn't last until in the 80s. By the 1980s, things were getting pretty bleak again. For one thing, the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan, which, of course, you probably know, we're still there. Afghanistan, the United States wasn't there at the time in the late 1970s, but the Soviet Union decided that they were going to, try and make Afghanistan into a communist country. And the Afghans did not want to be a communist country. And so this is going to be an example of a proxy war. The United States will go into Afghanistan, not with our own soldiers or anything like that, but we'd go into Afghanistan and we'd find some like Afghan guys and we would train these Afghan soldiers. Here's an Afghan soldier. And we'll give them our latest and greatest, missile equipment so that they can shoot down Soviet helicopters and shoot down Soviet tanks and all this kind of stuff. And so our brand new weapons in the hands of Afghanistan soldiers were very effective. And so Afghanistan suddenly starts to look to the Soviets kind of like their version of Vietnam. And so I think there's probably a lot of Americans going, finally, they get their Vietnam, because, you have these regular, ordinary people who've become, soldiers in the Afghanistan's army. They're sneaking around and shooting at Soviet soldiers, just like in the Viet Cong, where shooting American soldiers in the jungle. Okay, so now it's really kind of like turnabout, and this is kind of how the Soviet Union eventually is going to lose this war, to the same degree that the United States kind of ran out of Vietnam with our tails between our legs because we got run out of there. Similarly, the Soviets are going to get run out of Afghanistan. So this was going to be turning into a major Soviet mistake, and I think they would later realize that this cost them dearly. Prestige in the world, the whole world. Why are you sending in these? If these people want to become communists, then they'll ask for your help. You just came in there, and now they're trying to defend themselves. So by the end of the 80s, it's clear that the Soviets want out. So Afghanistan, they get out. Later on, of course, we'll get in, and of course, we're still there. By the early 80s, there's also going to be some United States feeling a little more pride in coming back, and our economy once again feeling good. Our hockey team defeating the Soviet Union in the Olympics, and that was a major feeling of kind of nationalism and pride and things like that. So the United States in the 80s is feeling good, and the Soviet Union is feeling bad. It's kind of an interesting difference between like the 60s and the 80s. Okay, the next Soviet leader after Brezhnev is this guy. He's a younger Soviet leader. Usually people had always associated these Soviet leaders with being very old, and there's a couple in between here who are really old. But Gorbachev, he's going to be the new Soviet leader. Ronald Reagan's going to ask him to tear down the Berlin Wall and open up the Soviet empire and try to kind of dial it all back. Reagan calls the Soviet Union an evil empire, and there's some real fear that we're getting back into a really, not détente. This is not détente. This is not, friendly relations. This is going to be kind of that early time where we're thinking, oh no, the Cold War is coming back in a big way. Because Reagan really had his, point of view, and Gorbachev was new and they didn't know kind of what to expect of him. Reagan was talking about putting these new satellites into outer space called the Strategic Defense Initiative, but the media just called it Star Wars because, of course, that movie was popular back then. The idea that Reagan was saying is that, well, we'll start building these satellites in outer space, and we can use these satellites, and they'll shoot lasers, and if the Soviet Union ever were to launch a whole bunch of nuclear missiles at us, well, we'd have these satellites up there, and they'd be able to shoot the lasers at the Soviet missiles, and we'd blow them up, and we'd be able to protect ourselves. And, well, for the Soviet Union, that just sounded really expensive. Is that where the Cold War is going to go now? We're going to try to go off into outer space and build all these high-tech, space lasers? That seemed like the Soviet Union's like, do we want to do that? And a lot of people weren't sure if this was even something that could be done back in the 1980s. Some of the Soviets were saying, oh, this is just a trick. He's just trying to get you to think that the Americans have, this kind of high tech and that we can do that, and it's still decades and decades off, and that the Americans are just going to try to, start a new space race to try to bankrupt the Soviet Union. In any event, it did get the Russians to talk more to us and to recognize that there's some problems that the Soviets really couldn't fix. And mostly it was their economy. So if you see, here's Gorbachev, and he's got himself this old Soviet truck. See, it's this old beater, right? And imagine the engine is communism, okay? And so he's tinkering with it. He's like a mechanic, and he's trying to tinker with it, and he's trying to fix the Soviet economy. But at some point, a lot of people just kind of, throw up their hands when they've got a car or a truck or something like that, and they've just been trying to fix it and jury rig it and, keep it together with, tape and spitballs and gum, and after a while, it's just starting to fall apart. After a while, you might just say, you know what, it's not even worth trying to repair this. Let's get ourselves a brand new truck, because this thing is a mess. Well, that's kind of the metaphor here, okay? The USSR, the Soviet Union, communism just can't really run and support the people. The communist nations, they're getting further and further behind. Their economy is very inefficient. They can't provide consumer goods for their people that have a chance to see on TV, what's life like in America. They get really jealous. They're like, why is it that America has all this stuff? They've got computers there and, games and clothing, and I want, blue jeans and Coca-Cola and McDonald's, all this kind of stuff. And when the Soviet people see that and what America has, and they kind of go, okay, Gorby, I call him Gorbachev. Okay, Gorby, can you fix it? And he tries, but, it's really, really hard to fix something that's as broken as the Soviet economy was. So what he ends up doing is, talking his way, and this is going to be good for the United States and the Soviet Union. Because it's going to lead to another thaw. Okay, so early on it was very much kind of like a return to the Cold War, and now that they get to talking, Ronald Reagan, president, and Mikhail Gorbachev. And now that they get to talking and they find out they actually have a good relationship, they're very friendly to each other, and the whole world is going, okay, well, maybe they'll be able to work something out. Maybe they can, reduce some tensions and once again, maybe strike some deal on some nukes and things like that and figure out, one way that we can lower tensions. And so that's all well and good. Okay, shortly after Reagan leaves office, George H.W. Bush will become president, and I'm not going to get into the whole how every single country in the Eastern Bloc, decided to leave. But suffice it to say, these Eastern European countries over here that were part of the Warsaw Pact, they're going to say, you know what, we've had enough. We want more freedom. When the Berlin Wall begins to come down and Germany starts to reunify, it's pretty clear that the people who have had a choice in the matter, the Poles and certainly the East Germans, when they have had a choice, they clearly don't want to be part of the Soviet bloc, and so they make that very clear. There's people out in the street protesting, et cetera, et cetera. And by 1991, what's happening within the Soviet Union itself, Gorbachev's losing his power. A new man by the name of Boris Yeltsin comes to power, and he says, you know what, the Soviet Union's over. All of these countries used to be part of the Soviet Union. Okay, so all these down here, all of this got to be part of the Soviet Union. And this guy named Yeltsin basically says, you know what, it's done. We're just going to split up and call it a day. Say, communism, yeah, you had your 70 years, you failed, and basically it just ends. And everybody is like shocked in the world that it just ended? What, there's no treaty? No, there's no treaty. And America doesn't say, okay, you agree to end and you agree that we won. No. The Soviet Union just falls apart on its own, mostly because communism has a really bad hold on their economy, and a lot of people were starving for freedom after all those decades of being brutalized by Stalin and not having any kind of freedoms. By the early 1990s, they were ready to call it over. And so you see here, all these countries, like you got Ukraine, you got Kazakhstan, you got all these different countries down here. You can see which each color represents. They all became their own country. Russia, the red one here, is the biggest, of course. That's Russia, okay? And so Yeltsin's successor takes over Russia, and of course he's still there today, Putin. And people ask, is there a new Cold War? I guess the way to think of a Cold War is usually people say it's got some ideological part to it, like we want to spread communism, and America wants to spread, capitalism and democracy and things like that. Well, that's not really happening anymore. There's nothing really that Putin wants to spread other than, he's got some, I guess, trolls in the internet that wants to sow distrust of democracy, but there's not much that he's trying to say, hey, everybody in the world, look to Russia. We've got, what do they got? Not much. I mean, it's a big gas station at this point. They got oil. And even that right now, not a lot of people want. So it's not clear that Russia, in any event, has anymore the kind of power that it once had as the leader country in the Soviet Union. That might not be true for China. China may be the next area that we're going to have another Cold War with. And that seems to be shaping up. So stay tuned. You're seeing that even as we watch the news on a day-to-day basis. But everybody, that's the Cold War for the 40-some-odd years that you saw it play out. And I would hope that you have had a chance to talk to some grandmas, grandpas, anybody who was part of this era and kind of knows what this era was all about, and see how the world was divided in so many ways, and how different places around the world ultimately fought for their freedom or fought against being a part of some sort of a colony. They wanted to break away from that. There was a lot going on in this era, and it's one of those things which I hope that you guys now appreciate, and I hope that you now have had a chance to talk to some people who are living and have lived through this. Okay, this was a big era in global history, and within U.S. history in particular. The United States was a major actor in this worldwide competition for the hearts and minds of all the people in the world.